Welcome back, everyone, to the Friends of Ukraine Roundtable discussion. Last week, we had some amazing guests, and this week, equally as fantastic. We are joined by Jonathan from Silicon Curtain, Vlad Vexler, and Anna from Ukraine. Let's just go around, and if for some reason some of my subscribers don't know who you are, give yourself a quick introduction. Jonathan, you go first.
I'll go first. So I've been doing this a little bit less time than Jake, but my channel started just after the full-scale war, mainly focuses on Ukraine, Russia kind of issues. And there are a million reasons why I'm sort of doing this, but one of those is I have spent quite a bit of time in Russia. I speak fluent Russian. It does help to understand a bit of the propaganda stuff and to help share that information with our beautiful community.
I want to quick ask you, how many interviews have you done on your channel? Do you know?
I do. I log them in a lovely spreadsheet, which hopefully no one's ever going to hack because there's a lot of details in there. I'm up to 446, plus there's the news roundup. So we're going to hit 500. It's always a bit of a challenge to know who to invite on when you get to the round number. I feel it has to be sort of special, as it were. So, but it's quite a milestone coming up soon.
That's a marathon. Almost 500 interviews in 2.5 years.
In 2.5 years. And the irony is I went to university with some people who joined the BBC, etc., and they aspire to do this sort of stuff. And here I am, an absolute nobody. And, you know, I've interviewed all these extraordinary people, including the lovely Vlad and Anna, who we've got here as well. But there are moments where you sit there and you've got someone like Fiona Hill on the other end of the camera, and you're just thinking, what the hell's going on? How did this happen?
I think there's a lot of YouTubers talking about this war with imposter syndrome. I'm definitely one of them. 2.5 years ago, I was not the guy to be doing this, but if you just do it every day, eventually you become the person. You become the expert. Let's go to Vlad. Why don't you introduce yourself if people don't know you?
I'm Vlad. I'm a political philosopher, and I am in a few places on YouTube, on Vlad Vexler Chat, which is unedited and uncensored, and on my main channel. And I'm so happy to be here. I'm loving looking at Anna's smile. I remember 2 years ago, Anna visited me on my channel, and we still have that video, which is, I think, now titled "Why Putin's Afraid of Young Ukrainians," a very evocative, concentrated little chat we did. Around that time, Jake and I talked a lot about Russian propaganda. And also around that time, John messaged me, and he had 4.5 subscribers at the time. And I went over to his YouTube channel, but he already had dozens of interviews with experts. So I could see this was going to move places. And, you know, John and I enjoyed so many conversations together too over the last 2 years that we have all been intermingling. So it's lovely to see everybody, and lovely to not see, but feel everybody who is with us watching.
Welcome, Vlad. Good to see you again. Anna, who are you?
Well, I am Anna from Ukraine, and that's the way my YouTube is named, and I believe it tells a lot. I was not a professional YouTuber, and I never took vlogging seriously, also before the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, when I have recorded my first vlog, and since then I vlog daily, which is sometimes difficult, but taking into account what my countrymen have to go through, it's nothing. And I am not a politician, not a military person, but I often compare myself to a professional Ukrainian. Why? Because I have discovered with this war that love to your country is very real. And there are lots of important details that happen in our lives and can actually explain Ukraine better to the world. And that's what I'm trying to do on the channel. And we often say here in Ukraine that among all the terrible things that this war did to us, it also introduced us to beautiful people who support Ukraine to a great extent, something we did not feel, we did not hope was possible at the very start of invasion. And I want to thank all of you, beautiful people, this beautiful community, as Vlad says, for making this choice and speaking and supporting Ukraine and our fight for freedom. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for being here. And if anyone doesn't know who I am a retro NES speedrunner. That's what I like to do, full time. But this YouTube thing's just a side hustle. These roundtables are meant to be casual, just people hanging out. Pretend we're just four friends in a coffee shop catching up. I understand there's so much stress and anxiety around this war. I just want to get people together who support Ukraine and have a nice conversation on it's my Saturday morning, but for you three, it's Saturday evening. Jonathan, let's start with you. What is, who was your most recent interview and what did you guys talk about?
So the last one was last night. It was recorded pretty late, so I was already feeling a little bit vague. It was finished around sort of midnight, and it was with Ivana Stradna, who is a sort of geopolitical expert, a security expert. She's, I think, originally part Serbian, a couple of sort of different sort of origins to her there, but she's a real expert on the Balkans area. So one of the big topics we talked about was the democratic slide or the autocratic slide that so many countries are experiencing. And of course, there's a whole spectrum of that. And in particular, the autocratic playbook, which Russia has provided an example of, and we kind of expect that Russia, it's probably not a sort of formalized thing you can kind of download in a zip file, but there are, here we go, Dictator's Handbook. There are a bunch of techniques, things like foreign agents laws, which are being actively encouraged and exported, and different countries are on a different sort of sliding scale of that sort of democratic autocratic slide. We talked about Serbia, we talked about Hungary, Slovakia. They're not all in the same place, and their journey down this route is not the same. And Georgia, probably one of the most significant ones we touched upon, where, of course, Russia is actively trying to, export its corrosive its techniques to corrode democracy and erase it in Georgia. Quite a pessimistic conversation, actually, because we also touched on Africa as well, where it seems that the US and Western allies, France as well, have essentially abandoned big chunks of the African continent to China and Russia. And there's a lot of concerning stuff going on there. Wagner getting its claws into the Sahel, sub-Saharan African region. And generally, it's a fairly pessimistic kind of conversation. Prior to that, I think Anna's seen this one, but Mr. Garry Kasparov sort of came on the channel, and lots of good stuff there. But it's also interesting talking to someone like Anna, because there are things that even the most ardent Russian opposition say that can grate a little bit on, Ukrainian ears, and grate a little bit with the sort of reality that as Ukrainians experience it. So interesting to do the interview. Also interesting getting, feedback from my Ukrainian friends on that one.
I grew up in the 90s, a chess nerd, so I'm super jealous you got to interview Garry Kasparov. Maybe if I can get my channel a little bit bigger, I'll reach out to him and see if he'd come on my channel. Or we can get him on a roundtable. How exciting would that be?
The nice thing is, well, one of the things, this is one of the things that I didn't know that much about, but I've kind of used a little bit of a business skill, which I had before, with just using things like LinkedIn. If you want to close a deal or something, how do you reach people? How do you get to them? Who are they connected with? What are they interested in? And that's the kind of techniques I use here. So someone like Garry Kasparov, it's a little bit like a chess game, there might be a dozen or 2 dozen things I have to do, or other people I have to connect with in order to eventually get to him. So
someone he knows has to vouch for you.
Pretty much, or someone like that, absolutely.
Yeah. Vlad, let's go to you. Most recent video you made, you were talking about, once again, modern Russian disinformation. How do you think we're doing? How would you score the West as far as this year, perhaps turnarounds, and our ability to combat modern Russian disinformation?
At the level of directly combating it, maybe 2 out of 10.
All right.
At the level of protecting our democracies, that they're more immune from this, 3.5. So there's a tremendous room for improvement, which is both about understanding the threats coming in, but it's also about understanding that there are certain levels of resilience we can work toward, which means that we're much less vulnerable to malign foreign interference. But, you know, as always, when somebody says something pessimistic or doomy, every tiny, point out of 10 that we make progress on makes the world a better place, and so that's always possible. There's no political situation which can't be made a little bit better and a little bit better than that. But we have a lot of work to do, I think.
Anna, let's get your reaction. What are people in Ukraine saying about Putin's trip to North Korea? All these pictures and videos of Putin, his picture along the highway, giant banners and giant portraits in Kim Il-sung Square. How do Ukrainians feel about seeing Putin with the living god, Kim Jong-un?
Well, it's so natural. They look so good together. And there are actually lots of memes that I cannot describe here because, I have a polite channel. But the guys were sharing a little bit pessimistic visions. And as a Ukrainian, I want to share with you my optimistic morning to make this less formal, as you've warned us, Jake. Tonight at dawn, approximately 4 a.m., I was sleeping with my windows open, and here I hear loud sounds like aircraft flying, and my semi-safe city was targeted today. But I was thinking different. I was thinking like, perhaps these are F-16s arriving to Ukraine, and they have to fly over my region, which is in the west, crossing the border with Poland. And I was literally thinking 100% they are flying in the direction of Crimea to target Kerch Bridge. Well, not tonight, but I'm sure sometime soon this will happen. Concerning North Korea, for us, Putin is already very similar as the ruler of the North Korea. And in general, all these monstrous regimes, they are very alike, actually. That's why, for example, the supply from North Korea is so good for Russia, because they typically have very similar missile systems, very similar ammunition, and very similar mindset. What we desperately want in Ukraine to happen, those neutral people who are still looking for ways to negotiate with Russia or to treat Putin as a real politician, not a criminal, not a terrorist, that they will finally have no arguments after seeing him hugging, talking, and signing agreement with the sample of what a dictator is. So hopefully this will be one of the strong arguments to those who still manage to remain neutral.
Oh, Jake, I think we should fire a question at you.
Do it.
So this is one really for you and Vlad, I think, and this is actually quite a thorny problem here, because I think we all try to create, I would say, bipartisan kind of platforms where we don't want to alienate one group against another. We want to make sure people understand the reality in Ukraine. But in the last week, we had both former President Trump, and in the UK, we had Nigel Farage, both repeating almost word for word a classic sort of Kremlin talking point, which is the war essentially is the fault of NATO. NATO provoked the war. Haven't heard that one for a couple of months, but here he is in the context of 2 different election campaigns. It's reared its head. It's not always constructive to come out straight away and say, they're a Russian asset because they've repeated this narrative. No, they must be controlled by the Kremlin. That's obviously highly divisive and alienating. But this is a kind of problematic story here. And that is not I would say, not a narrative that people close to the situation think has any veracity. How do we tackle that? And how do that narrative going to play in the US versus the UK? Because this is be interesting to hear Vlad's point of view. I think it can be quite alienating in the UK, but it seems to have some resonance in the US.
In my last video, I shared a poll done by the Ronald Reagan Institute showing what % of Americans support continuing sending military aid to Ukraine. And it's something like, 60-30. It's not even close. It's 2-1. And for some politicians, they just want that one. They don't care about the two. In their district, in their states, if they're a populist, it's all about getting eyeballs on social media. So it's very profitable to be counter to what the mainstream opinion is. So day to day, I argue Americans are not paying attention to the war. They're not engaged, but they do have a firm opinion of what they believe. They support democracy. They support NATO. They support Ukraine. They know Russia's the aggressor, but they really don't want to pay attention to the day-to-day details. They're focused on other political issues, or they're just trying to go to work and take care of their family. But for far-right politicians, outside the mainstream politicians, these are their people, the conspiracy theorists, the people who think that, lizard people secretly are controlling the world. They have to speak to those people. So maybe for a politician like Nigel Farage, I know nothing about UK politics. I know the name, but I don't really know anything specific about him. But if his support base has already gone to this position, he needs to catch up to them. He needs to be consistent with them to keep them as followers. That's how I interpret the situation, but perhaps I'm wrong. I have two gentlemen from the UK here, so I would actually love to hear what you guys think about his recent statements.
John?
I know quite a few people who voted for Brexit, and this isn't one of those like some of my best friends voted for Brexit. That sounds like a little bit like a racist trope there, but I do know people who voted for it, and I do know that whereas you can question motivations for either voting for Farage or Brexit or so on, you might question that actually that doesn't bear any relation to reality. If people can give a good account of, I think, of why they did it, at least you can have a constructive conversation. I suspect Farage coming out and saying this will not just grate on the ears of people who are not going to vote for Farage. I kind of expect that some people who would actually have supported him might look at this and go, hang on a second, that smells off. I'm not sure it'll have mass appeal. It does cement his position as a contrarian, as someone who is here to tear down traditional politics. I'm not sure that particular line will win him any friends. So I wonder why he did it. I don't know what your thoughts are, Vlad, in the context of the current election.
Well, I think, because probably about 15% of people watching us are from the UK, but the rest aren't. Just let's paint a context of what's going on here, Ukraine-wise. We're going to have a change of government in literally a few days. It won't be a change that will dramatically affect Ukraine. Most people in the Zelensky-Yermak administration feel probably slightly more positive about Labour than they did about the Conservatives, because the policy is the same, but the level of seriousness of the people behind the policy is going to be just that little bit higher. There's going to be no song and dance exploitation of support for Ukraine. Now, the Labour Party, who are going to be the next government, are not in possession of a strategy for solving the conflict or a strategy for a Ukrainian victory. They have very similar positions of just continuing to support Ukraine and seeing what happens, as the Conservative Party did. But they're a lot more morally serious. They're much less incompetent. So that's what we are going to have politically. In terms of where the British people are, we are not as intensely pro-Ukraine as the Baltic and the Scandinavian countries, but we are we're very widely pro-Ukraine. In other words, the number of people in Britain who are positively sympathetic to Putin are in the single digits if you study polls. And I've been studying quite a few polls because there's an election coming up. We are more intense in our support for Ukraine than the Spanish by a long way, and a bit more intense than the Germans, the Italians, and the French. but much less intense than the Baltic states, than Poland, and then the Scandinavian countries. But Ukraine is not a major issue in British politics. If you try to class issues sort of A, B, and C, Ukraine is a C-class issue to do with fixing the local roads in terms of significance. It's issue 7 to 9. But we are not polarized about it. Another issue that's issue 7 to 9 is the Middle East crisis, and there is more polarization. But on Ukraine, there isn't much polarization. And even if you look at the only political party that is Ukraine skeptical in the UK, which is the Reform Party that Nigel Farage is associated with, they're in a mess about it. Their leader went to deliver supplies to Ukraine on camera. The supporters of the party hated him doing that. But even when they are expressing their Ukraine skepticism, it's much more about let's focus our attention on Britain rather than Putin has a valid point of some kind. So you could see that in the equivocation of how this exclusionary post-truth populist politician Nigel Farage spoke. He was trying to say something and then half take it back, and then trying to say something again and then half take it back. He is actually a little bit gentler on this than Donald Trump. He is sometimes parroting Russian propaganda and then taking it back. And what he's really saying is, we can't trust the establishment, and therefore we can't trust anything significant they're doing. And one of the most significant things they seem to be doing is supporting Ukraine. So let's just be mistrustful because our politicians are against us, they're betraying us, and the political game doesn't even make sense anymore. So when we listen to that kind of speech, I always recommend, as I obsessively re-emphasized in my last video, to break people down who seem exploitative into entrepreneurs. They're people who are just surfing the waves of public opinion for self-promotion and convenience, but are not positively set on breaking the democratic game. So the political entrepreneur is a danger, but is a corrosive presence rather than a direct danger. They're not out to positively break institutions. And then there are post-truth populists who are positively out to break the democratic game, and they're more dangerous. And that speech from Nigel Farage is probably 3/4 of the way to the post-truth populist position, but with a dose of entrepreneurialism still. So it's really important to categorize these people. But what we mustn't do is jump from the correct observation that they're parroting Russian propaganda to the conclusion that their supporters are dumb and are morons who need to wise up, because their supporters feel suffocated for political oxygen. So what we want to think about here is giving their supporters more political oxygen and more democracy. And that's part of that order I always obsess about, which is that our crisis of trust is creating a fertile environment for the flourishing of disinformation, rather than saying that the disinformation that the evildoers all around the world, like the Ruskies, and they are doing that, but that the disinformation they're seeding is the cause of our crisis of trust, which of course it is partly, but I like to reverse that priority. That's a little bit how I think about this.
Anna, what do you think, or how do you feel when Western politicians like Donald Trump or Nigel Farage say that the reason why Russia invaded Ukraine was because of NATO? It's all NATO's fault.
Well, of course, we know that disinformation, Russian disinformation, also works in Ukraine, but this is a kind of argument that even people who were neutral before the start of invasion or who sympathized Russia would never accept. No NATO, no biolaboratories, no fighter birds, nothing like that here, I guarantee you. But The thing is that if we look, like, I know Putin with his interview for Tucker Carlson, introducing Pechenegi and old history, ancient history, tribes and everything, it was very tiresome. But at the same time, if we look back in the history of Ukraine-Russia relations, we will definitely see that at least 300 years of wars between our countries existed. And for example, there are lots of there is a city of Baturin, which was once the capital of Ukrainian hetmans, Cossacks leaders, and in 1708 it was totally destroyed by Peter I troops, killing lots of women, killing lots of men and children. The city was unprotected. There was serious excavations, archaeological, and what is more dramatic, that the head of these archaeological excavations was killed on this recent Russian war in Ukraine when he joined the territorial defense. And the city was similar to Bucha or Mariupol, but just 300 years ago when there was no NATO and the US was too busy with, some other internal problems. So, of course, it's not about NATO. We have to be realistic and look at the actions because Russia uses this term, it protected itself, but from what? I'm sorry. This is just like a pathetic Belarus dictator with a pointer showing in the map. I will show you where the offensive was getting ready to. So this is, of course, very pathetic, but at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, why did Putin go to the Northern Korea? Of course, not just to beg for the weapons, because he will get them. He already gets them in the large quantities, and it's very important for the Northern Korea economy, which is purely militarized. So perhaps they have discussed some important issues, and I won't be surprised if Putin tried to inspire him to attack the Southern Korea, for example, because that's what he needs. He needs chaos, he needs wars in different parts of the world, and it's not because of NATO, it's not because of anything else. It is just because for Putin, war is a survival mode. He simply needs war to continue being the ruler of Russia. Without that, he's dead.
It's an extraordinary... I mean, following on from Anna said, there's an extraordinary interview I remember watching, and it was about the 2008 financial crisis. And I don't think it was Greenspan, but it was someone who was working with Alan Greenspan there in the sort of US central bank. And this anecdote went along the lines that when the financial crash happened, and if you've been in business, you've probably lived through quite a few of these, but 2008 felt like quite a big event in financial terms, and it felt quite risky. And obviously it was followed by quantitative easing and all the other stuff that came after it. The story goes that at the point of the financial crisis, Putin tried to reach out to the Chinese to say, right, call in the debts. We can crash the American economy. We can crash the system here. And this is a great opportunity to kick things off, as it were, destroy the international order. That obviously was met with incredulity, apparently, according to this anecdote, by the Chinese government. Like, what are you talking about? We're very much dependent on global trade and finance. And they thought that was an insane idea. Fast forward however many years it is, I think the intention on the Russian side is the same, and that is to tear down the US-led order. Whether it's established some so-called multipolarity, etc., I'm not sure. It feels far more nihilistic, which is, let's destroy this order. We don't quite know what we're going to replace it with, but we're going to be more prominent in whatever chaos ensues. And it seems this time around, there's a little more traction from China, Iran, and other places, a little more, let's say, receptive to the idea of changing the international order.
So I just want to come in very quickly with a couple of points. First of all, about NATO, I think that we sometimes risk being unconfident in how we talk about our feelings about the way NATO expansion was done, because we try to accommodate ourselves to the way the Kremlin itself conceptualizes. It's quite frankly, it doesn't matter what our views are about how we did NATO expansion. Putin has an imperialist project that has nothing to offer the world except violence. That remains true, however we would have done NATO expansion. So we're entirely within our rights to debate how we did NATO expansion. I mean, there are plenty of alternative ways of doing it. I mean, there are some arguments about taking NATO right to Russia's border, for example, immediately after the Cold War. There were plenty of arguments about a tiered entry into NATO via the Partnership for Peace. We made plenty of mistakes, like talking about welcoming Ukraine into NATO without welcoming Ukraine into NATO. You've got to do either one or the other. So even if we did do some things wrong, that has absolutely no bearing on the truth about Putin's project. And quite frankly, he can bugger off. It's our business to discuss how we conducted our foreign policy. We could have done things a lot better. But the bottom line remains, whatever view you have of what could have been done different, Putin's project retains all the truths about it, which is really, really terribly destructive. And then the second point I wanted to quickly make, this is a typical academic situation. I've forgotten what it is. What was the very last thing that you said, John? You were talking about, the destructive aspirations of the Putin regime. I just wanted to
nihilistic.
I wanted to say something very quick, because I was a tiny bit grumpy about how that absolutely precious institution that keeps our democracy alive, the institution of professional journalism, dealt with Putin's ultimatum. Because I enjoyed, in quote marks, the full 1.5 hour speech. And what was clear in that speech isn't just that Putin was asking all of these offensive and outrageous things, like taking over bits of Ukraine he has little chance of militarily conquering. He also talked about, again, demilitarization and denazification, quote unquote. But much more importantly, this is what I think the headlines almost entirely missed. In that talk, where he delivers the ultimatum, he effectively asks for the withdrawal of NATO from Eastern Europe, and that wasn't reported. And his language was, it is essential for the attainment of Eurasian security that inappropriate projection of military power by third parties be removed. That's not an exact quote, but that's roughly what he said. And what he really was talking about is what the Russians came up with in the pre-war ultimatum. And I just wanted to say that because what you were saying, John, reminded me of this, because we sometimes forget the most obvious things, which is that the aspirations of the Kremlin remain in place, whatever their levels of success and failure in the prosecution of the war. Sorry, Jake, to butt in like this.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't a peace treaty. It was a peace tantrum, is the phrase I think I used in one of the videos. An absurd thing. How did it go down in Ukraine, Anna?
In Ukraine, without the. And here is the question that I have. To take away the focus from the Kremlin and have a look at what is just, this is a question in context of NATO that we often have here. There are a number of times when Russia crosses NATO border with its drones, with its missiles for 39 seconds to Poland, coming with its aircraft. And I think every normal, adequate personality understands it's not accidental. It's not an accidental thing, just as North Korea soldiers crossing into the neutral zone between two Koreas. These things are not accidental. They are testing NATO countries. And from a Ukrainian perspective, we are failing these tests because we are not doing anything. What do you think about this kind of reaction when Russia definitely intentionally crosses the border of NATO countries with different kinds of weapons?
So I think last week a Russian plane crossed Swedish airspace over the Gotland Island. Not an accident. Russia did this on purpose. But I watched YouTube videos explaining this, and the best thing NATO can do is not react. Whenever Russia does something, they're looking for a reaction. They want provocation. They want the West to overreact and to scare their own people that a war between NATO and Russia is likely to happen. The videos, this was last year, of these surveillance drones flying over the Black Sea, and Russian jets are just constantly swerving in front of it, dumping fuel on the surveillance drones to try and knock them out of the skies. Like, it's so absurd. And the United States just doesn't react. It never reacts because at the highest level, they've come to the conclusion that's what Russia wants, and just don't give Russia what they want.
How do you square that with what Turkey did? Because Turkey took a very different approach. You warn the jet to turn away. It doesn't turn away. They shot it
Russia
out of the
also,
sky.
for its propaganda machine, at least internally, or to negotiate with China, Iran, and other friends, they need an image of weak NATO countries, and they also use it as an argument.
So with Turkey, I mean, if we can just be honest, Turkey kind of is its own thing. I don't think Turkey's ever going to be allowed into the EU. They've been an EU candidate for decades now. And Turkey was admitted to NATO as one of, I think, the founding members, along with Greece, to box in the Soviet Union. But Turkey has always put Turkey first, and I'm not going to criticize Turkey for doing that. But they have their own regional problems and their own regional interests separate from NATO. Given their proximity to the Middle East, given their proximity to other major military powers, Turkey always just does its own thing. So yes, shooting that Russian jet out of the sky, what's Russia going to do? Russia can't get mad at NATO. Russia's mad at Turkey. So yeah, Turkey's the one setting the boundaries for their region, given that it's so volatile. And I mean, how many millions of refugees, tens of millions of refugees have crossed Turkey trying to get into Europe? And that's a problem unique to them that they have to deal with.
There's other ways in which, and I think it's called salami slicing tactics, isn't it? But there are other ways in which NATO can be tested and probed. And as Anna said, it can be held up as an example of Western weakness to Russia's allies. So the other recent example, of course, was the removal of river buoys in between Estonia and Russia, I think in the sort of Narva sort of area. If you've ever been there, you've got a very dramatic scenario of Ivangorod. There's a big fortress, and there's Narva, another fortress on the Estonian side. But they basically removed the buoys that mark the international boundary. That's rather a provocative move. There are many other things they can do, from the cases of sabotage, assassination. These won't stop. So at some point, surely we have to react and push back.
Plus, there are some philosophical or ethical moments. For example, with that Russian missile making a turn in Poland, it was like for 39 seconds in the space of Poland, and later returned back and injured someone in Lviv region. And it was also not about like provoking NATO, but also a potential to save some Ukrainian lives on the way back.
In there. I've been told by military experts. I've been told by some military experts that actually it's very difficult in that instance to actually target and shoot it down. No, I'm not arguing that. I don't think they had any intention to do that.
On a daily basis, it's kind of always difficult, and debris and other stuff. But once again, this can also be used by propaganda and by other messages. Like, there were lots of jokes like, no, we're not going to stop this missile. It's going back to Ukraine.
Another thing is NATO is responding to Russia every single day. The continuing supplyment of arms and weapons to the Ukrainians is NATO's response every single day. If Russia could find a way to stop the supply of weapons across the Polish border, they would do it, so they can't. And if Russia could find a way to win this war, they would do it, but they can't. So NATO does not directly react because NATO is responding every day by continuing the shipments of weapons so Ukraine can defend itself.
I like it how you highlighted that in one of your videos, that from one point of view, Putin always says that he is fighting with NATO, but from the other point of view, he's constantly like afraid, and he speaks about that it might lead to something. So he hasn't made up his line directly whether he's fighting with NATO or not.
Jonathan, going back to your comments about Putin in 2008 or 2009, hoping the Chinese would dump their U.S. debt and, cause a financial crisis on top of a financial crisis. But I think, well, at least back in 2009, I don't think President Xi was in charge yet. This was Hu Jintao, or the leader before Xi. But the leader before Xi, I want to assume, knew how dependent China is on trade with the United States.
Yeah.
And it's the United
Yes.
States Navy patrolling the world's oceans. If our 11 supercarrier groups stop patrolling the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, piracy will skyrocket. The post-World War II Bretton Woods Agreement that the United States, if you want to use the forceful word, imposed on the world, we said, we are going to patrol the world's oceans, stop all imperial buckarooing, privateering. That's what empires did in the 1800s. And everyone who wants to trade with everyone can trade. Make your own rules, make your own agreements. The United States Navy will make sure that nobody attacks your ships. China can't survive without the United States Navy. They can't protect their own commercial shipping, and they're a net importer of energy and food. So if the United States Navy stops protecting Chinese shipping, China collapses. That's I think what's holding them back about their invasion of Taiwan. I still think they're going to try something in the next couple of years, but it's not going to work out well for mainland China, in my opinion.
I think there are people that understand that. I think there are also many people in China that understand what has happened in deep Chinese history when you have periods of economic turmoil. You have incredible bloodletting and chaos, and mentioning piracy. I mean, some of the largest sort of pirate fleets in history are Chinese ones, if you go back sort of to the sort of 19th, 18th century and so on. I think there's a deep understanding of the chaos that can be unleashed. And as you say, a sort of deep fear. I think they understand that despite the agreements and some of the benefits that China gains or accrues from getting Russian crude and from shipping consumer exports to Russia at hugely inflated prices for inferior goods, that is a tiny, tiny fraction of the business that they do compared with, with the EU, with the US, and despite, recent sort of trade aggravations, the trade it does with Russia is minute in comparison, and always will be, because the Russian leadership in no way want to empower their country to create a middle class and create that sort of huge consumer base that would potentially benefit China. So I suspect they are much more cautious than, often they're labeled as being, anti-Ukraine and siding with Russia. I think they're extremely cautious on that, and I doubt whether they're going to change too far, move into the Russian camp.
Vlad, I've not really heard you talk about China much in your videos. What are your thoughts on all this?
Well, it's partly because it's important to not tread on people's feet, and there's a tendency for people to step on experts' feet and for experts to step on each other's feet. So the gap of understanding between my sense of Russia and my sense of China's internal machinations is very substantial. So the gap in quality drops off very far if I begin to talk about Chinese strategy. I think that I am much more concerned about Russo-Chinese coordination of the challenges they present to us. And I even use the expression a Russo-Chinese quasi-alliance changing borders in Europe when it comes to the Ukraine war. And certainly when it comes to potential escalation we might see from China in the future, there are all kinds of worries we should have about that being timed and coordinated with the Russians. The dependency that Russia is developing on China now is necessitated but unnatural for Russia's political elites. In other words, if Putin evaporated tomorrow, the overwhelming majority of people in the regime would feel very awkward about deep dependence on China in all kinds of ways, even in terms of political culture. Russia is enormously normatively dependent on the West in the way it thinks about its politics. Even when it's trying to beat us, it is offering a negation of us that is enormously reactive to our own concepts of how the world should run. So I see a very pessimistic prognosis for Russian dependence there, but I also see a lot of space for coordination between the Russians and the Chinese. The Chinese are more pragmatic in my assessment about Western decline than the Russians are. Russians are more ideological. They don't just see us as having problems, they see us as being on an inevitable course toward collapse. So even this somewhat awkward isolation, which is nowhere near as complete as many of us would like it to be, of Russia in the world, it is not as oppressive as we might imagine for them, because they anticipate a re-engagement with the West in 5 to 10 years from now, when, and this takes us back to where we started, Le Pen, Farage, and Trump type leaders take over in major Western European countries. The Chinese are much more pragmatic about their strengths and weaknesses, it seems to me.
I couldn't believe this story, this report out of Japan, that there's talks between China, Russia, and North Korea. And Russia is considering giving control of the Tumen River to the Chinese. As far as dependency, the Russian elites, I imagine they are feeling a little anxious about talking about respecting historical borders when they're controlling a lot of territory that used to belong to China. China had their century of humiliation between the 1850s and the 1950s, and the Western powers took Chinese land. They carved it up. The Germans, the British, the French, the Portuguese. And China got all their land back, except from one country, the Russians, still sitting on Vladivostok. But this Tumen River, to me, this is, I think the biggest obstacle to this transfer is the North Koreans. I don't think the North Koreans want Chinese shipping, Chinese commercial ships coming in and out along their coastline, their border, because that's economic activity they can't explain to their own people. They don't have international shipping. So for Chinese vessels and Chinese merchants and fishermen or whoever coming up and down this river all the time, when zero ships come up and down that river now, I think it's incredible.
And the other detail was them pegging their currency against the yuan and away from dollar interactions. That, for anyone who's spent time in Russia, I mean, even on a personal level, people, especially in times of hyperinflation, would convert what they're buying into dollars. It becomes a kind of universal unit that you can kind of get a grip on what's happening with changing prices. And I think this is both a psychological and a huge, technical change, which is not going to end well.
Anna, what are your thoughts about China not participating in the peace summit in Switzerland?
Well, I think it was predictable. And at the very start of the invasion, it seems to me that Ukrainian government and President Zelensky personally was more optimistic about China. They were trying to communicate more. They were trying to deliver the messages. Also, by the way, the Chinese were pretty active in Ukraine, but in times of President Yanukovych, there were different programs, grant programs, borrowings programs, and so on. But at a certain moment of time, perhaps they've realized it is not real. And despite this cultural differences, still Russia and China ideologically have more in common. I totally agree with John and with Vlad that China is very pragmatic. They have chosen wait and see strategy. And what is worse, it seems like both versions, Russia winning, Russia losing, is not bad for China. Of course, Russia is super dependent, and there are lots of processes happening in the cultural sphere, in the educational sphere, when China renames Russian cities that were once Chinese back in their books, and nobody protests, contrary to stealing Ukrainian history. So you may say they do not object to similar things done by China in accordance with what they consider Russian cities. And what is interesting right now and was discussed after the peace summit is how actually China will react to Putin's visit to Vietnam, to Putin's visit to the North Korea, and for example, even the two main rivers that you have just mentioned, because there are certain things that China may not like, being like the patron of the North Korea and so on. So of course, it's not a friend. But it's more pragmatic party that at a certain moment in time can abandon Russia. And for Russia, that will be a serious trouble. But at the same time, once again, as a Ukrainian, I have promised myself at the very start of this war that I won't be ignorant. And I realized that China is so great, and perhaps there are lots of nations now suffering, like Uyghurs, like many others whom I don't know, just because they are hidden behind the Chinese wall. Another kind of, metaphorically, like an iron curtain. So, of course, there are lots of things that prove it's not the country that shares our values. So we cannot hope. We can only hope that it will stop interfering and backing up Russia.
Free Tibet. Vlad, what are your thoughts on North Korea?
Well, you I think put out a video of, was it Ceausescu's visit to North Korea, which was
on Twitter.
even more theatrical
Yeah,
than Putin's. I think that I basically had two thoughts looking at it. One was a thought about how sick and toxic it all looked and what that means for politicization at home in Russia. And the other thing I thought in constellation about the visit to North Korea and to Vietnam is how much we're living in this world of enemies in certain respects, this world of frenemies, where a country is in opposition to another country in certain respects, but is also making deals in 3 or 4 other respects. And how difficult it is for people to get their heads around that. So while it's true that Russia has very few true allies, I mean, we're just looking at Iran and North Korea effectively. The number of countries who are...
What about Belarus?
It's a country without sovereignty, I'm afraid, at the moment, right? And it's a tragedy for the Belarusian people. The only thing I would say, and I'm not the only one to say this, if things begin to go pear-shaped for the Putin regime, a very plausible starting point is Belarus, not Russia. But we have a lot of countries keeping Russia, interconnected with the world. India's binging on Russian oil. Much of the world is completely unpersuaded by Ukraine's arguments about peace and democracy and being on the side of civilization, which is also something that I think could be improved very considerably I think Ukraine has much better arguments to make than currently its government is making. The strongest argument the government of Ukraine makes is that Putin won't stop, which I think is a very strong argument, but I think even that argument could be made better. So I think back to what we were saying earlier about propaganda war, again, there's room for improvement, much room for improvement in the West as well for advocates for Ukraine. But I think we are in this world where we always keep encountering facts that make us flinch if we want to see things in too rosy a way. I mean, for instance, the European Union broke a record of grain imports from Russia in 2023. So it's a complex world where we have 90% enemies, that 10% still countries we have constructive relationships with. And this all is stuff that happens to us all too often. It's not stuff about which we have enough of a strategy. But then back to the politicization business and these extraordinary images, you know, in North Korea. I thought it was very sick, very toxic, because as soon as you begin to think about what is behind all of this Riefenstahlian display, you realize these are people who got bussed in from outside of the capital. They probably didn't have facilities to accommodate them. They were possibly made to sleep on the street for a couple of nights on the pavements while rehearsing their Putin mosaics and their Putin banners. So it's particularly toxic, of course, to participate in it the way Putin did, with much more ease than the last time he did this in 2000, when he was smirking, rolling his eyes and thinking this is some kind of alternate universe. This time Putin was, I don't want to say he was like a fish in water, but it was much closer to that. And what that speaks to, at least symbolically, is this really scary process of politicization in Russia that is stalling for the regime, but that the regime is really strongly trying to persist with. So just to give an infinitesimal update, not much has really changed, I think, in terms of what the Russian population think. We still have this depoliticized blob in the middle, and we have probably 20% of the population who are substantively pro-war. They don't just say, I kind of like the war, they make arguments in favor of the war. And there are 20% of the population who are substantively anti-war. There is also something else, which is reaching 40, 50% perhaps. And these are people who are declaratively favorable to the war, but do not express support for any particular war policy. And these are people who are just backing whatever Putin does. Putin wants to create massacres next door. We're going to outsource our politics to him and let him do that. Putin wants to withdraw from Ukraine and give Ukraine $10 billion. We'll support that too. There's also that. And this hasn't changed much, other than that in 2024, I think that the trend is a little bit more toward support for the war, whereas in 2023, it was a little bit more toward collapse of support. But here is two new things that I'm picking on. The extreme fascization of the Russian education system. And, you know, we talk about the abuse of children that the Kremlin is engaged in terms of confiscating kids from Ukraine, but they're also now beginning to engage in a different form of abuse. And that is reduce the education of young children to two things: ideologization and military prep. And that is part of this story of, if you like, the partial return of Soviet style rather than post-truth style propaganda. Not because it's Soviet in content, it's not Soviet in content, it's hard right, not hard left. But it's Soviet in form, because now the regime is telling these kids that they are going to be prepped for a big war with some kind of very big enemy, which is typically the West. And what's interesting, if I compare it to the tiny amount of war prep that I encountered in PE lessons in the Soviet Union when they had to throw grenades at America, is that back then this was ideological, whereas much of this propaganda that's happening now in the school system in Russia is almost teaching children that war is good as an end in itself. And that's a much more fascist rather than communist position. And then this other trend that I'm noticing and thinking about much more when it comes to the Russian population is the resistance that's manifesting to this attempt to ideologize the population. And the resistance comes in part from this depoliticization and from this new word I've invented last week, which is hyper neoliberalism. And if by neoliberalism I mean a kind of magical giving of primacy to the market should do everything, and I don't want to explain why. So I think if you are constructive and you give arguments about why the market is better, that's not neoliberalism, that's just a strong argument for the market. But then hyper neoliberalism is when you say the market should always have primacy, but by primacy of the market, I actually mean competition of all against all in an unbounded and unconstrained way, which just means not that this Hobbesian state of war of all against all is a natural thing, but it's actually kind of a normatively good thing. And I'm relating this to how Russians think of the war, which is to say, as a certain kind of expression of what effectively is a financial transaction. That's to say, there are two parties, the West and Russia. They failed to divide something. Ukraine doesn't have agency in this picture. Sorry, Anna. But Ukraine and the West have failed. The West and the Russians have failed to divide something. We can't know what that is, but it's like two business parties quarreling, and that's followed by soldiers fighting on each side because there are these two sides in some kind of a business deal that has gone wrong. So, of course, what's utterly missing from this picture is the fact that Ukrainians are victims of an aggressive invasion, that there are bakers and plumbers having their lives ripped up on the front. So all of that is missing. There is this kind of mysterious business quarrel that we must stay out of. And that's a new feeling I get about how some of the depoliticization and sort of apolitical attitude to the war sits now. But Putin is trying to go step by step, a little bit North Korea in it, above all by transforming the education system. So sorry for this rant.
What I'm hearing, this reaction to Putin's visit, Putin signed a defense agreement with the North Koreans, saying that if the North Koreans are attacked, Russia will come to their defense. But people are saying this is a huge strategic blunder for the Russians to do this because they weren't taking into consideration what South Koreans thought of this defense pact. Russia, of course, is assuming when they sign this, well, if the United States attacks North Korea, sure, we'll defend North Korea. But what if North Korea starts a provocation with the South and the North get into a shooting war? Some limited engagement. Well, now the South Koreans are saying, wait, Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. Is Russia going to use 6,000 nuclear weapons against us? The North Koreans on their own had 6 or 7. That not a great prospect, but manageable. So now the South Korean government, they just recalled the Russian ambassador, and they're demanding answers. They're outraged, and they're seriously considering providing lethal aid. Up until this point, they've only been providing humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. They've been selling artillery shells to the Americans. The Americans have been sending from their stockpile to Ukraine. So South Korea has still been in the game, selling tanks to Poland, but I mean, they seriously could flip this month and start providing lethal aid packages to Ukraine in response to what Putin just did.
I think this has got to underline that Putin, I'm sure some of you have seen the Twitter or X account, Darth Putin, and the joke is that Putin, master strategist, and yet everything he does seems to blow up in his face. I think you have to sort of look at this and say, well, what was he intending to do by this? One, probably out of desperation. He needs that industrial production. But I think there's something else going on here. And the fact that it's not going to go right doesn't mean that he didn't have some kind of intent. But I don't think it's massively strategic, but it is him perhaps looking at escalation management. This is probably got a big conversation piece. Escalation management, which has limited the supply of support, military support to Ukraine over the last 2 years, limiting its capacity to actually achieve a victory, especially in 2022. There seems to be some easing of escalation management. There also seems to be now a path towards F-16s arriving. You know, we see the degradation of Russian air defenses, including the early ballistic missile warning systems, which can also be used, you know, in the conventional sphere. You're seeing this sort of NATO-style softening up in readiness for F-16s. It seems that Western allies are, you know, losing their inhibitions a little bit, and escalation management is losing its force. If Putin's realizing that, that may explain some of the desperation. So going to North Korea isn't just like getting access to artillery shells and so on. It's also going back to a tried and tested formula, which is, I'm a bit mad. You know, don't provoke me, don't escalate, because I'm a bit mad, I can do anything. And being seen with Kim Jong-un, who everyone thinks is somewhat unhinged, probably including the Chinese as well. I expect they are a little bit wary around, you know, the chaos that can be unleashed by North Korea. This, I think, is part of that terroristic strategy of Putin's to say, look, don't mess with me because, you know, I've got some crazy friends. I'm a little bit crazy too.
I didn't mention this in my last video. I wanted to, but I forgot to say it. But I'm going to say it now. Kim Jong-un grew up in the West. He grew up at a boarding school in Switzerland, watching the Chicago Bulls win 6 championships in the 1990s, watching American movies. All of his friends were, you know, the children of diplomats living in the West. So it's just truly ironic that this grand coalition to take down the West and destroy the West is made up of people who love the West. They can't get enough of American culture and Italian villas and, you know, Turkish yachts, whatever. We've come up on the hour mark, so let's go around. Anna, do you want to say what you got going on or something you're thinking about? Some final reflections for this live stream.
Well, I think that everything is much simpler. We do like to think about complicated things and discuss and mingle them, and it's extremely important. But at the same time, it's all very simple. Russia is an aggressor. Russia has violated hundreds of international agreements that were working before Russia started doing it. Nothing similar happened during this decades. And then there is no need to look what might have been a reason, was it always like that, zones of influence, and so on. For billions of people, Kim Jong-un was always a crazy person. There are lots of documentaries, there are movies. He's not like standing next to him is not okay, it's obvious. There is no need to even I mean, like, evaluate that. For many normal people, I think that's already a signal that these are very like crazy people that are capable of doing whatever they want. And of course, with such people, de-escalation management does not work. De-escalation works with those who can listen to you, who have something to lose, who are ready to compromise. Here it is impossible. So in these cases, just as with other deadly, I don't know, viruses or diseases, it's extremely important to hit hard and hit really quickly. Because once again, if we look at 2014, the annexation of Crimea, let's not escalate, let's not provoke. A couple of days, we have Donbass region occupied. Then we have decades of something, we're not naming it that way, not to cause conflict, and it's all not that important. There might be some reasons, we have to listen, blah, blah, blah. And then we have full-scale invasion in Ukraine, and I know Vlad said that's not the strongest argument, but here in Ukraine, we often discuss that we are actually giving time for other countries to get ready. And some hear us, like the Baltics, like Poland, that demonstrate this strong support. And I'm grateful to the US and to Great Britain, because we do feel we don't need to explain ourselves to you. You understand, like, you are with us. But I think actually that's a strong argument, but the fact that many still avoid hearing it. And once again, it's often repeated that it resembles 1939, not 1938. Perhaps it's a part of human nature, normalcy bias, the desire to see something as far away from you. But it's all very interconnected, and all from, again, my Ukrainian perspective, very vivid, very black and white. So I'm very grateful to the beautiful communities of your channels that do a lot, starting from conversations that they hold in the countries, persuading those decision makers who are, luckily in the democratic countries, are dependent on our opinion, and finishing with real NAFO trucks. Jake is a record breaker. And I'm jealous in a very good mode to your achievement. This is really great, because this is what saves Ukrainian lives. And we have to understand that, like, every support, every donation, every word, every letter to a senator may actually result in a saved Ukrainian life, or in a child returned from Russian captivity, where his or her identity was changed. And for me, as a Ukrainian, it's so obvious and it's so weird that witnessing this stolen children, tortured prisoners of war, hijacked nuclear power station, blown up dam, ecocide, Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, we still have to convince that Russia is evil. And, you know, Kim Jong-un is not just like Putin meeting someone else. This is, if we were shown something similar 20 years ago, we would not have believed it's possible. And in one of your videos, Jake, you have beautifully described your life like in two halves. The US when you were like approximately up to your 20s, in the 90s, and the one that you live in now. And I so much like this description of this like 90s, of this strength and leadership. And I think it's still present, and that's the way we see the United States and Ukraine. There are lots of contexts that we lack from your countries, but we see them as strong. And we believe that we are strong, and somehow with all of these troubles, with all of these doubts, negotiations, and still, we will prevail. And thank you for doing it all together.
The 90s were great. I really miss the 90s. Vlad, let's go to you. Do you have any final thoughts, or what's going on with your channel?
My channel is slowly moving along, as always, just sometimes slowed down by my health challenges. I suppose I have two just brief thoughts. One's a kind of ethical thought, and one's a tiny political thought. The ethical thought is that there's something we don't talk about enough, and that is the Ukrainians who are caught up under the Russian occupation, because that's a big territory. It's a lot of people. And what's going on there, from what we gather, is a form of apartheid regime that in many ways is reminiscent of some of the imperial practices of empires of the last couple of hundred years. I think we don't sort of ethically weigh that enough. I think it's a very extraordinary human predicament, and don't have anything to say about it. I just want to put it on the table. And then the second thing I want to say is that, without legislating on all of my opinions about the West's lack of strategy and the West's incapacity to generate a strategy because of the condition of our democracies, I am increasingly passionate about a more political mode of argument when it comes to making the case for certain moves on the international stage. I'm in favor of us talking more in these terms. I'm also in favor of Ukraine talking more in these terms. In other words, I'm increasingly skeptical, though there is a huge place for it still, of talking about joining the civilized world, I think that is one I'm particularly skeptical of. And I'm increasingly skeptical of not talking about it is good, but centering democracy and freedom and stopping at that. I do think that the argument about Russia not stopping is a good argument. I think that sometimes we can make it in a more nuanced way so that we don't get sort of booed out of the room for being alarmists. And instead, I'm keener on conversations about how we want to imagine the future of Western alliances, how we want to imagine European security needs being met, how we want to imagine not just Ukraine's security, but Ukraine's geopolitical indispensability. That's one of the big things that there's a lot of room for improvement in, because you do not achieve geopolitical indispensability by talking in largely moral terms about civilization, democracy, and freedom. Ironically, that is what the Russian opposition talk about all the time, and we sometimes mock them for not being political enough. And so that's one preference I have in terms of making us more alert to the threats we in Europe face. And in the end, that is the point of view from which I talk about with my community. But I also think this is very important for getting Ukraine closer to having a chance of a fast-tracked EU membership, having a chance of a clear path into NATO, which I think is far off, having a chance of strong security guarantees, serious Western commitment to Ukraine's reconstruction, and having a chance of keeping and regaining as much of its territory as possible. So I'm a fan of speaking more in the language of politics, national interest, and security, and less in the language of morality, even though I accept that the language of morality does appeal to some and still does appeal to Western populations to a good extent who do remain outraged about what's happening in Ukraine.
Jonathan, let's go to you. Do you have anything going on and final thoughts?
There's a lot going on. I mean, I'll pick up from where Vlad left off on the themes that I think the channel is moving towards. I've been examining a lot what we're calling here the authoritarian toolkit. And of course, it's not formalized into a single volume, but there are lots and lots of different techniques, and it's a mixture of technique and narrative. And as in any arms race, it's always changing and adapting to different purposes. So examining the authoritarian toolkit made me think, well, we will most certainly, this has been unfashionable really since Iraq and Afghanistan and the miscalculations involved in those conflicts. But I think having a democratic toolkit or building a concept of being more bullish about democratic values and what constitute them, and something that Vlad talks about a lot, which is the sort of democratic decline, how we can actually revitalize those, how we can look to Ukraine's example, which has been able to, in some part, de-Russify itself over the last 30 years. And it's been able to have multiple revolutions, each one seeking to establish whether consciously or unconsciously, some sort of democratic norms and fight against, the informal practices associated with tyranny and with the way Russia exerts sort of control and influence. So I think that's going to be a big focus there. Also going to be moving the channel onto, Ukraine's going to remain the core focus, but I think given that Russia's ambitions are global, and its nefarious ambitions are global, it will be useful to start focusing also on India, China, the African continent. So I'm going to try and get a lot more speakers from different parts of the world. We're going to do an episode on China, an episode on Hong Kong, speaking to one of the leading dissidents there. These videos, unfortunately, the algorithm on YouTube is extremely cruel. Those videos do not get that much traction. I think it's kind of sad that that's the case, but nonetheless, I'm going to be moving in that sort of direction. The other big news is much more practical and personal, and that is that I'm within sort of spitting distance of 100K on the channel. So there's a final big push to get it over the line there. but the ambition is to keep growing, because this summer I'm transitioning from doing Silicon Curtain really as a thing that I do in the margins of my existence, and it's increasingly come to take over my whole mind, but it hasn't taken over all of my daylight hours. That's going to change, and so doing the channel, extending the format, doing different videos, traveling to Ukraine a lot more is something that is going to happen from sort of late August onwards.
Well, if you can join one of my convoys and drive one of my trucks, I would greatly appreciate that.
That will definitely happen. I'm joining an aid convoy to do some filming in September. I would love to drive one of your trucks in. That would be incredible footage, and we can drop in and see Anna on the way as well.
I actually have
Sure.
some fun news, but Artur Rehi is getting married this weekend. So he's having his wedding, and I will be appearing on his podcast on Wednesday. I don't think it'll be published Wednesday, but we're going to film it Wednesday. But that's what I got going on. Thank you so much for joining. This was a lot of fun. I greatly appreciate it. Hopefully we can have you guys back on again and maybe shuffle it up who's appearing with who. Thank you so much,
Brilliant.
everyone.
Thank you.
We've got
Thank you, Jake.
over 4,000 people still watching. So thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us. If you're not subscribed to all these channels, please go subscribe now. Fantastic voices in support of Ukraine. Thank you,
so
everyone.
much,
Thank you, Jake.
everybody.
Thank you, Jake.
Thank you,
Well,
Jake.